I think I would now come to an even more enjoyable part of the programme, which is to the science. And the first speaker is Allan Chapman, Bishop John Wilkins, visionary of mechanical space travel and pioneer of popular astronomy 400 years on. Allan.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much indeed. It's an enormous pleasure to talk to you about this gentleman. I have other pictures I was saying at the end, but I find it easier to talk. Could I have the better lights as well, please, if possible? Lights a bit brighter, please, yes. Thank you. I'd like to be able to see the audience too. John Wilkins, 410 days old today. 1st of January, 1614. He was a remarkable figure, but let me start first of all by passing on, I think, an interesting parallel. I have said in print and in the media already, I strike by the way in which he was the natural ancestor of our late Sir Patrick Moore. There are many parallels. Both men were absolutely fascinated by the moon. Both men were fascinated by the idea of travelling to the moon. Both men, as probably many of us are in this hall this afternoon, were in a way protégés of Patrick Moore. People like Christopher Wren, Robert Hooke, and others, eminent figures of their day, but also protégés of John Wilkins. He also, too, was a pioneer, rather like Patrick, of good, lucid English writing, at a time when most science was written in Latin. He was, of course, a fine Latinist himself. But on the other hand, he was getting out there, aiming at the kind of person who could read their Bible, listen to a Shakespeare play, or read a cheap book of jokes. In other words, a lovely, clear, lucid writer. He also, too, like Patrick, was in another important respect, an immensely sociable figure. We're talking primarily of the period here of the 1650s, the times of Oliver Cromwell. Maypoles were banned, Christmas feasts were banned, mince pies were banned, everything was banned. But Wilkins kept a jolly house in Wadham. And in fact, we know this from the surviving documents, the amount of wine that was spent, beer which was spent, celebrations for that gunpowder treason to celebrate Guy Fawkes Day. And even on one occasion, he brought in an eminent German violinist, Thomas Balthazar, to delight them. So, like Patrick, he's a big sociable figure as well. And I think in this respect, he's so important for outreach and the way in which not merely astronomy, but also the physical sciences have that outreach dimension. Who is John Wilkins? Born, like I say, the 1st of January, 1614, probably near Cannons Ashby in Northamptonshire. The seat and area owned by his maternal family, his mother's family, and in fact his dad was Walter Wilkins, a Oxford goldsmith. Now you've got here husband and wife, both, if not perhaps rolling in it, at least comfortable. Goldsmiths were also bankers in the 17th century. So on his father's side, he has commerce, banking, goldsmithing. On his mother's side, landowning, land patronage, and the church. In fact, his maternal grandfather, John Dodd, was not only an owner part of their estates, he was also a clergyman, bringing another important dimension into, which interests me, the science-religion relationship which he pursued greatly. Now, where is he so significant? At this time, Galileo is still alive. Kepler is still alive. Sir Francis Bacon is still alive. Copernicus has only been dead 80 years. Isaac Newton is yet unborn, 1642. Wilkins came onto the stage as a true intellectual tyro, educated partly in a school in Oxford, then at Magdalen Hall, Oxford, which later became Hertford College, then ordained into a living owned by his family, which very, very kindly his granddad, the Reverend Dr. John Dodd, looked after, allowing him to travel to London, to Oxford, the continent, and to establish excellent working relationships, especially in that part of Germany called the Palatinate, North Germany. at a time, of course, when there was a great deal of hot involvement in Europe at this time. Wilkins, at the age of 24, published his first book. And this was on the idea of the moon being a planet. And I think I can put a picture of the title page of this up at the moment. What we see here, that's the title page. Copernicus on one side, Galileo with his telescope on the other. Here we have a discourse concerning a new world in the moon and another planet in 2 books. But look up here. The sun, I am heat, light and force. All the planets are rotating around the sun. And look here. The universe goes to infinity. In other words, the implication being, as he says in the book, that the sun is probably only so important because we're so close to it. The stars are probably suns just like our own sun. And that's why, whereas Galileo found 20 years before, in 1610, that when you make a better telescope, you see more dim stars, a better telescope, more dim stars. Doesn't it go to infinity? How vast is the universe? This is one of Wilkins's implications. Now, I am being very clear here, he does not invent this idea. Wilkins is not an original scientific discoverer. He's an original and an inspired visionary of science. All this is in earlier writers, but he is taking continental material, English material, and presenting it to the kind of person on the English streets who might turn up on the bankside and watch Love's Labour's Lost or The Tempest across the river. That is superb scientific outreach. You imagine folk around the village inn, or folk around the far side, having read this book. Is the universe really so big? Is the moon really a world with continents and seas, as they thought, like we did? And the big implication too, are there beings living on it? Wilkins gives them the generic name Selenites, from the Greek goddess of the moon, Selene. He says this, we don't know anything about them. We don't know whether they're there, what sort of beings they are, whether we'd recognize them. But I was sure there must be some kinds of beings there. If the universe is a place of worlds, like our own, as opposed to in the pre-telescopic period, just lights in the sky, can you have, as it were, houses with no one to live in them? Can you have no worlds with no one to live on them? The implication being, do we live in an inhabited universe? This is 1638, 1640, the 2 editions of this book. Now, one important argument which he advances here is interestingly theological. Why should God make habitations without habitants? So should there not be spirit beings or physical beings on these other worlds? And in fact, too, that in that deeply theological age, it leads on to other questions. Are they saved or damned? Now, the whole body of ideas which pour out of a series of telescopic discoveries, you can understand why in that age he was almost, without using the terminology, getting onto what you might call exoplanets, because he was perfectly willing to have the idea that there's something could be going around these 10th magnitude stars up there, and, well, after all, there might be living intelligences on them. This, I think, is remarkable, and it's presented to a general readership. But then, in addition to that, he's especially concerned with travelling to other worlds. Now, this, I think, is very important. There had been other people who'd written stories of voyages to the moon, Lucian of Samosata in 160 AD, and various others. But these were all what you might call political diatribes. We have a bad world here. Let's set a perfect society on the moon. And so that you get hit by birds taking you up, or demons, as in the case of Kepler and 1 or 2 others. Wilkins is having none of that. How do we get to the moon? He knew the distance of the moon fairly accurately. The astronomers of that time did. And he talks, first of all, of a conveyance, as he says, to get us there, and also to what would the journey involve. He thinks of what he calls a flying chariot. A flying chariot, a machine capable, under mechanical power, of raising itself off the ground. He thinks of a small ship. He mentions a pinnace. A pinnace was a small vessel, the kind of things that Drake and Raleigh took with them on their sort of messages, but perhaps containing a very powerful clockwork motor, powering through gears, wings that could do that. And up you could go. You only needed, he believed, to rise 20 miles. Using work from Gilbert's De Magnete of 1600 and his own experiments on magnetism, and tracing the Earth's magnetic lines on a model spherical magnetic stone, he believed that proportion for proportion, the Earth's magnetic field, and hence, as he thought then, its pull, only went up 20 miles. Get up 20 miles, and then you coast into the moon. He thinks half a year, 180 days. Now, you may say, it's a long time. Not at all. This is the great age of discovery in geography. Wilkins is fired up with stories of Magellan, Columbus, what he calls our Drake and Raleigh, and all the great navigators of the age. Richard Hakluyt in Christchurch in Oxford had just published his monumental series of volumes on the English voyages of discovery. All this is in print at the time. Why, therefore, we can't be sent through 180 days through space? After all, it takes you a year to get to China, 9 months to get to India. What's 180 days? So the idea, therefore, of the long voyage in some kind of ship-like vessel is part of his thinking. How would you provision it? Now, here we have some wonderful thinking. And Wilkins is nothing if he's not ingenious in dealing with problems. What about air? Well, it's well known, of course, that the higher we go up a mountain, the more out of breath. You get goat herds and so on get out of breath. But he said, that's because the Earth is corrupt. Once you're beyond the 20 miles and you're in space, then you're probably in pure air. So it'd be lovely. What about heat? You'd be basking in the warmth of space. He assumed that there'd be some kind of breathable material up there. What about food? Forget food. We only, and this is what I'm sure people on diets would love to hear, Wilkins argues that we only eat because the pull of gravity pulls food through our bodies. Once you're beyond gravity, a cheese sandwich will last you 180 days. It's visionary, it's slightly crazy by modern standards, but don't forget this is being written by a man in 1640 for an audience which actually could have seen Shakespeare, could have met Shakespeare. So this is why I said its visionary power is so great. Wilkins' idea of a machine, as I'll be showing from one or two of the other pictures, I'll try to in a moment tell you. Oh, yes, that's the wrong way, I presume. There we are. This is Wilkins outside Wadham with a group of the early fellows of the Royal Society and other dignitaries. This is another early way of flying to the moon that was suggested by one 17th century early figure. But that's what I'm really concerned with. That is his wonder of gears. He calculates that if you have the right gear ratio, then you tie the bottom of that machine to the roots of an oak tree. A man gets up to the top and goes, and all the gears will increase to the ratio of 100,000 times, and the tree will be ripped up out of the ground. Why not have such a device powered by a clockwork motor to power the wings of your flying chariot? This is the extraordinarily visionary idea. Nothing was known of inertia, nothing of inertial tension. That lies in the future. We're dealing here with a man at a very, very limited period of history, what I've referred to as the honeymoon period of science, a time when we have discovered wonders, yet we still don't know how much more has to be discovered before anything real can really be achieved. What about Wilkins also as an educator? Wilkins is very important in the use of the telescope. We're told that at one stage he had a telescope of 80 feet focal length. Why 80 feet? Because that gave you the best views of the planet. It would probably have had an object glass of about 3 inches. But you think of this, you're trying to find beings on the moon or Jupiter or wherever. The best way at that time you got the magnifications was by a very long focal length, simple lens with a powerful eyepiece. In that way, you might get 300 workable magnifications. There was even speculation with his friend Robert and protege Robert Hooke. Do you know there are certain parts of the moon's surface which at high telescopic magnifications remind you, quote, of the rolling pastures of Salisbury Plain. Now, where you find Salisbury Plain on the moon beats me, but it shows you the optimism that they were displaying. Hooke, some years later, even suggested we may have a telescope shortly that will reveal things the size of sheep on these pastures. We may see the interior of the lunar craters in the same way that you can now see the fair champagne pastures of Salisbury from about a quarter of a mile. Wrong, yes, we know, but it shows you the way you're going. This is so radically different from what had been done before and what had been suggested before. This is a new universe which they are exploring. Now, Wilkins, too, was a figure with a series of superb pupils. And I've always suggested that the only reason Wilkins never was a fellow of this society is because he was born 200 years too early. He would certainly have been so had he been born in 1814, not in 1614. Wilkins's clubbableness is important. And this goes back to what I mentioned briefly at the beginning about his years in Oxford, at least his years in Oxford as a head of a college, 1648 to 1649. So 1659, 11 years, he was warden of Wadham. Now, at this time, England is in a state of probably the biggest political turmoil we've ever endured. What we have at the present time is good order compared to what they had done. There's already been 8 years of absolutely bloody civil war. The king was executed on the 29th of January, 1649. Then you had Parliament packed by a collection of religious visionaries, and some of them perhaps who today would be, shall we say, on NHS care benefits, who were probably so strange in what they thought. We then have Cromwell taking charge of the country with the major generals, in other words, military rule. And then the danger is when Oliver dies, well, his sons are up to much richer, who will succeed him. Will Oliver's generals start going to war with each other? Will we have another civil war? And at that stage, of course, they invite the young Prince of Wales to come back from Holland as Charles I. Wilkins is living through that period of intense national mayhem. And what he does in Oxford, and especially in Wadham, is found what was described as a haven in these troubled times. Now, Wilkins forms a club. It was called the Oxford Philosophical Club. It was not a part of the university. It had no official standing. It was simply a private club of friends. And it included the young Christopher Wren, his great pupil. A man I might say he was an astronomer and a very distinguished one before he became better known as an architect. The young Robert Hooke from Christchurch. Thomas Willis, the great anatomist from Christchurch. There were medics, astronomers, all sorts of people joined them. And they normally met on Wednesday afternoons. And they were probably down together. They would talk about experiments, read letters they had received from friends on the continent. And the wonderful thing about it was fellowship. I argue that that club was not only the ancestor of the Royal Society, which it became in 1660, it was also the ancestor of this society, and the Jolsock, and the Society of Antiquaries, and the Chemical Society, and so on. You look at how intellectual patronage happened in continental Europe at that time. We can get it out. 20-odd years before, the academia which surrounded Cosimo II, Grand Duke of Tuscany. Hierarchic academies under the control of a great public personage. You were invited to join the group. If you weren't, your first didn't fit, you didn't go in. The Royal Society and the Wilkins Club that preceded it is very different. It was a group of friends. You came together, experimented, presented your results. If it was nice outside, looked at the moon or whatever was visible in the sky, talked about it, and you formed a fellowship. Now that, I think, is so important in British education. The idea that we've never developed, until I said it very recent times, top-down academic institutions. Think of the Oxford and Cambridge colleges from the Middle Ages, right even to this day. Fellowships. They are not direct, as it were, institutions. They had to pay their own way, elect their own members. Yes, they sometimes had financial difficulties, but it gave a thing you did not have in France, you did not have in Italy, and you did not have, what was at that time, in the German states. The ability to do what the heck you liked. And that intellectually is so very, very important. Yes, you paid for it yourself, and you depended on some rich members of the society to chip in the odd 100 guineas occasionally. But even so, it was within the group, and it was within a friendship community. That body of the early philosophical club, like I say, consisted of astronomers, medics, a whole variety of scientists of the day. And in 1660, when the monarchy was restored, it became the Royal Society of London for the promotion of natural knowledge. Wilkins became its first secretary. He would almost certainly have been its first president, for one reason. He married Oliver Cromwell's sister. Not the flavour of the month at that time. Yet, to talk about charm and plausibility, the man who's married Oliver Cromwell's sister 8 years later, becomes Bishop of Chester. Now you think of the social changes. Wilkins clearly was a man, as I think the first picture I had of him shows you, a man of enormous charm and an ability to get things done, so important even today. Let me finish by saying something about him in terms of his visionary ideas of machinery. Wilkins lived in an age where Europe, and the whole of European culture, was developing a love of technology. Machines that worked on their own. And I think why this is in many ways such a deeply European thing, we were never a culture with slaves. So hence, if you wanted jobs doing, machines were better than throwaway slaves. Other cultures, of course, had this outside Europe. Therefore, we have a love with machinery. Bacon, in the Silva Sylvarum and the Nova Morgana in the 1620s, is talking about the idea of the machine which will change life. Talking about progress, gunpowder, printing, and the magnetic compass have changed the world. Likewise, too, of course, further inventions, one after the other. In other words, this is a technology-based culture and a progress-based culture. Very, very significant at that time. And Wilkins drives that point home. In his Mathematical Magic, 1648, he talks of all manner of visionary machines and contraptions. There's that one, of course, I showed you. That's one early idea of flying to the moon, not by Wilkins. Look at that, a windship. Apparently already operating on the Dutch polder in 1640. A ship on wheels. It apparently worked between Alkmaar and Bergen op Zoom and could sometimes touch 20 miles an hour. It had no brakes, and this, I think, is the invention of smart kitchen gadgets. Think of this. Here's your fireplace, your spit down here. Here's a chimney casement. You put a turbine, or a vane as he called it, in the chimney. The hot air makes it spin. It rotates that rod through a birdcage pinion and turns the meat on the fire. Hot fire spins quick, cold fire spins slow. A smart invention. Wilkins didn't invent it, he gives us the full credit for who did, but that's a kind of transformative device that was making the new world as he saw it. Almost like a version of a modern car. Differential back axle. A wind car that could go in any direction no matter what the wind was doing. Brilliant contraption. And here we have Gresham College, which he knew very, very well in London, and where I had the honour of having a chair some years ago. Robert Hooke's famous long telescope, just like Wilkins had. This was his 60-footer. Wilkins had one 20 feet longer. And the idea of observing the planets at very, very high magnifications, making possible the discovery of Titan around Saturn, the Cassini division by Giovanni Domenico Cassini in Paris, and then the belts of Jupiter, jointly by Robert Hooke here in London and by Cassini in Paris. It was an amazing series of the realization of the telescope. In 1600, nobody had any idea of what the universe was like. By this time, 1660, they're discovering new things all the time, and also technology is capable of changing the world. What did his flying chariot look like? Well, he doesn't sadly give us a picture of it. But I have, over the years, read many things surviving from Wilkins, and, well, it's more or less something like this. This is meant to be slightly comical, but here we have Wadham College, accurately drawn down here. Then the machine is like a small ship, a pinnace, powered by clockwork motors, working wings. He said that eagles' feathers were best for the wings because they were the birds that flew the highest. Then off you go to the moon, starting up your 180-day journey, and here's his pupil and sidekick, Robert Hooke, in the front here, and off they go to the moon. That's what, as near as I think we have to what his machine looked like. It's my own reconstruction. Wilkins, though, lived long enough to see everything he had done disproven, at least in terms of moon voyaging. His great friend Boyle discovered the vacuum in 1658. Clearly, things getting very, very thinner as he went, it was not simply the bad air, it was simply you can't breathe. Space is probably a vacuum by 1670. Ditto too, the realization that we're getting to slightly understand radiant heat. Space could be freezing cold, just like the top of Mont Blanc or somewhere like that. And hence, too, they were coming to realize that food is not just simply produced by the pull through the body. By the time that Wilkins dies as Bishop of Chester in 1672, his earlier youthful visions of flying to the moon have now been shown to be wrong, but they have been shown by exactly the same intellectual processes by which he put them forward. Experiment, invention, counter-checking, disproving, all of this. Wilkins is not a fantasy writer. He is trying to probe possibility, but being fully acknowledging where perhaps we can't go. So I put forth John Wilkins to them because I think he's a wonderful piece of outreach. People are fascinated by history, they are fascinated by science, and he had a marvellous interconnectedness in that culture. So it's now nearly my time, and so with any questions. So this is the Bishop of Chester, John Wilkins, how to be born in England at that time, marry Cromwell's sister, and still die a bishop, and a very, very successful man indeed. Thank you.
One or two questions. Richard.
I'm slightly deaf. So
Oh, yes. I should announce that you need...
I was interested in your comments about him filling empty spaces with lots of people, because in geomagnetism we're used with the idea of Halley coming up with an idea for westward drift and large spaces and putting people in it, and we all laugh at him for that. But it sounds like he's part of a tradition.
So I don't... Did you hear that? I'm sorry, I couldn't quite get it.
Halley was laughed at for...
By us. Halley had a model for westward drift where he had different parts of the Earth with a hole,
Yes. Oh,
and he put people.
inside the Earth.
He put people in the gap. So it sounds like that was part of a bigger tradition of people doing this.
It was part of a whole series of debate and argument. There were people who had comic laughs at Wilkins. There was a poet in the late 17th century who spoke of flying to the moon on Wilkins' wings. This, of course, is an open society. This is a society where you say something, somebody shoots you down, you may get parodied, you may get laughed at. In 1676, an absolute box office success opened in London at the Haymarket, and this is called The Virtuoso. It was a parody of the Royal Society. And they were taking all the crazy experiments of the Royal Society, putting cats in air pumps and things of this sort. And it invents the model of the mad scientist, Sir Nicholas Gimcrack, who spent his entire days in mad experiments. So yes, this idea, you have the science, you have the discoveries, you have people taking you off, you have a laugh, but that's the nature of an open society. And Wilkins was in that society. And Halley too was deeply inspired by Wilkins. I was a fan of Robert Hooke.
Yeah, I'm going to draw this to a close
Yes, sir.
because of the time.
I
And
understand.
remark, of course, that Robert Goddard was made fun of by the New York Times.
Yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Who, of course, finally issued an apology in 1969.
Yes.
On July the 23rd, I believe. Okay.
But very crucial is humour.
Okay, I think we've got to pass.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.